Hello, everybody, and today what we're going to be focusing on is globalization, technology, diseases, and environment. So this begins Unit 9 in the last unit of the AP World Curriculum. And what we're looking at is how the world is getting smaller. And we're going to look at it in three different ways, through technology, diseases, and environmental impact. So the big idea is that technologies bring the world closer together. We are now interacting more across the globe than ever before, and that's because of different forms of communication. So, I'm sorry, different forms of technology. So, one form of technology is mass communication. And this is pretty self evident, in my opinion. So, in the 1920s, radio comes along and becomes more widespread. And the big thing that radio allows for is for the speaker to talk directly to the listener. Before, our form of mass communication was largely newspapers. So a newspaper reporter or a newspaper editor became a filter between what the speaker was saying and what the reader was reading. The radio takes that out a little bit. So now a political leader can give a speech and directly speak to millions of viewers at the same time. So it's no mistake that at the same time radio comes along, Hitler, Mussolini, both rise to prominence and power because they have this technology that allows them to speak directly to millions of their followers. Now, of course, when we think about FDR, he was also a good user of the radio with his fireside chats during the Great Depression. The president could talk directly to the American people, and that was a significant change. Television does the same thing, except it becomes visual, and the visual is a powerful, is a powerful form of communication. So, for example, in 1960, there was a debate between Senator Kennedy at the time and Vice President Nixon, who were both running for the presidency. And if you watched it on television, Senator Kennedy presented himself in a much better way and came across much better visually than Nixon did. Nixon was hunched over his podium, Kennedy was standing straight up. The makeup that Kennedy had on was much better done than what Nixon had. Nixon apparently had a fever and he was sweating. It was just a case that Kennedy looked better. So a lot of people walked away thinking Kennedy won the debate. However, people who listened to the debate on the radio believed Nixon was the better candidate. So now we start getting this idea that the visual becomes much more powerful. And what this leads to is what I like to call the first televised war, the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War, images from that war are being broadcast, but at the same time, civil rights protests are being broadcast on the nightly news. And that is going to shape the American opinion of those two events. The internet, coming in the 1990s, gives much faster access to knowledge and to information than we've ever had before. And what you have to understand is that the internet in the 1990s is different than the internet today. The internet of the 1990s, if I wanted something, I had to go to the website and I had to kind of know what I was looking for. But I had much quicker access to it than going into a library. So let's say I was doing a research paper, for example. I could go to the internet and type in the book that I wanted to review or the primary source I wanted to review, and I could find it instantly, as opposed to me going to a book and looking at it in the book. Now, today, I can go into those Google searches, and there's the internet searches it for me. That's a different development that happens later. But what the internet does is it allows more human beings, to directly access communication. And then when we get to cellular technology allows for instant communication. Now, anybody across the globe can instantly communicate with one another through cellular technology. So instead of going through fiber optics, instead of going through landlines, cellular technology is much cheaper. And if you take a look at the map that's over on the right, those are mobile cellular subscriptions. And you can see in Russia, which we would consider less developed than the United States, more people are using cellular phones. And that's because cellular technology is much cheaper. The darker the blue, the more subscriptions there are. So if you look at Latin America, you see a large number of people using cellular phones. 60 years ago, they didn't have phones, they didn't have telephones. When the industrialization takes place, instead of going through landlines and telephone poles, they go right to the cellular technology. And the cellular technology is going to be cheaper for communication, which encourages global trade, which we'll talk about in the next section. And then lastly, social media. And social media to me is probably the big game changer of mass communication because what it does is it democratizes communication. Now, everyone has a platform. There's no radio producer, no television producer that's blocking access. Now you can have almost an unfiltered ability to speak to the world. And as long as people are willing to listen to you, you can speak directly to thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. So social media isn't just Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but it's also YouTube. It's also WeChat. There's lots of different platforms out there that allow people to have instant communication and to give everyone a platform. Um, it's why we report people's tweets in the news. And somebody who really understood the power of Twitter as a form of communication was President Trump. What President Trump was able to do was directly convey his thoughts and feelings without having a filter placed between him and his followers. The news couldn't like cut out what he was saying. He said it directly. And that's a powerful form of communication. Developments in transportation also come in. Air travel, I think that's obvious. People's ability to get across the globe in hours as opposed to months. It's if you think about the trip from, Washington, D.C. to London, let's say, or to Spain, you can do that in a plane in about 5 hours. It took Columbus 6 weeks, to get from Spain to the Caribbean. So 6 weeks versus 5 hours, that's a drastic improvement. And the other thing is that this is going to allow for air travel of goods too. So trade is going to be encouraged by this. But to me, one of the most underrated developments of the past 30, 40 years is the development of container shipping. So what's happening is that goods across the globe are being mass manufactured, but they're being shipped on these super ships. We're talking about ships that are 1/4 mile long, and they're transporting cars, they're transporting electronics, they're transporting just about everything you can imagine. And there are sea containers, big rectangular boxes that are being put on these boats. If you remember recently, the Suez Canal was blocked up by one of these ships from the company Evergreen. And when that 1/4 mile long ship got a little diagonal, it clogged up a trade artery. 90% of the world trade is done through this method of containment shipment or container shipments. And that's probably within the past 30 years, that's really accelerated. And we don't even realize, we take it for granted that this is going on. So this represents a new transportation technology. Think back to Unit 1 when we talked about saddle technology that enabled camels to carry more things. Well, we've come a long way from camels and their saddles. We now have these huge ships that can carry a lot more than a couple saddlebags. Lastly, sources of energy. The industrialized world consumes energy. And the more industrialization spreads across the globe, the more countries become industrialized, the more demand for renewable and non-renewable sources of energy there are. So non-renewables, we usually classify them in with fossil fuels: petroleum, natural gas, and coal. Those three become the primary sources of power throughout most of the 20th century and the 19th century, but most of the 20th century. And actually, they're still the significant sources of power today. We still rely on non-renewables. We still rely on fossil fuels. Now, the problem is that once you use it, it's gone. The earth is not going to create more. So it's not a renewable source of power. There's only so much oil in the earth. And once that oil is gone, we can't make it again. So as we create more demand on our sources of energy, we are seeking new sources of energy that are both clean because there's an environmental impact and renewable. One form of energy is going to be nuclear energy. Now, nuclear power comes out of the atomic age. We explode atomic bombs, and then somebody goes, I wonder if we can harness that energy to create power for people instead of destroying things. And nuclear power plants start to pop up largely throughout Western Europe. Russia's going to have some, Japan's going to have some. Most of the industrialized nations will play with this. The United States, probably about 5% of our energy production comes from nuclear power plants. And the only problem with nuclear power plants, of course, is that if something goes wrong, it has a detrimental effect that can last years. If there's an explosion or a meltdown, radiation becomes a significant problem to a widespread area. So nuclear, when done right, is clean and renewable. But if something goes wrong, it can be devastating. Just ask Chernobyl. Japan is going to have like a damage in an earthquake to one of their nuclear power plants. And they're going to be moving people out because of the potential fallout. And of course, and as you guys know, we've seen a push lately into wind and solar energy. There's a reason why solar panels are popping up on people's houses. And that's because we're pushing and developing that technology. And that is your focus on, I don't know why that highlighter popped in. That's your focus on the types of technologies related to power, transportation, and communication. Other technologies, and if you take a look, I apologize, the Green Revolution has the letter D in it. It should be E. Medical technology should be F. But the Green Revolution is when science, new science, modern science, gets applied to farming. Now, we've been doing this ever since human beings started farming. We started farming back in like 5500 BCE. So we're talking about something we've been doing for actually probably further back than that. We've been doing this for 10,000 years where we've been farming. And at the beginning of farming, we looked for better ways to farm because farming is hard work. And we've developed technologies to make it easier. But throughout history, we've had jumps in how we apply the technology. So 10,000 years ago, we had our first jump. In about the 1750s, we had a second jump. And then in the 1960s, we had a third jump. And what's going to happen is the science is going to start crossbreeding crops. So crops are going to be crossbred in order to produce higher yields and to resist drought more effectively. We are also going to go in and modify the genetic code of these crops to make them more drought resistant and make them more productive and give them higher yield. Pesticides and fertilizers result from our understanding of chemistry. And pesticides and fertilizers are going to be a way to encourage increased growth of crops. And then there will be new machinery. By the way, ignore that little highlighter, that laser pointer. I'm not controlling it. It's just kind of recorded into the PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. So the new machinery is going to bring in just larger machines that can do more work. So these four things together are going to produce an effect that I don't think you're going to be surprised at. More food is going to be produced. And this food is not just being produced in one little area, but it's being exported across the globe. So this exporting of food is going to lead to more food availability for the human population. That's going to lead to a growing human population. The population of the 20th century is going to take off, and it's supported by these innovations from the Green Revolution. But another impact is that this Green Revolution, these new machines and these new chemicals and these new medical developments, scientific developments, cost money. And that means the small independent farmer cannot afford this. So what the small independent farmer does is he starts selling the land out to the large farmers, starts selling them out. And there you go, I'm all the way down now. So they start selling it out to the large farmers. And now we have corporate farming. Now, if you take a look at the graph, you can see, look at the grain production and how that jumps. This is in India, and how Indian grain production from 80 million tons, it drops to 70 million tons, and then it jumps to about 105, and then it jumps all the way up to 160 tons. So the Green Revolution over a period of, what is that, 27 years, I think that is laying out? Yes. Over a period of 27 years, it doubles the grain production of that country. And that is a significant development to support a growing population. Medical technologies is the other thing. Medical technologies are going to allow people to live longer as well. People are going to be able to live healthier lives. And they're able to beat diseases and infections. So antibiotics are one such example. Penicillin being the granddaddy of them, the original antibiotic. What antibiotics do is they kill off infections. So, for example, in World War I, if a person was shot, they were more likely to die from infections that set in later from the injuries than they were from the actual wound, from the actual gunshot. In World War II, penicillin is going to save a number of soldiers, not just from death, but also from amputations, because infections can be controlled. And that's what penicillin allowed for. And eventually, penicillin gets onto the broader market of people. And now that we have these antibiotics, we can fight off infections. And those infections, which used to cost a number of lives, is going to be curtailed. Vaccines are going to develop as well throughout the 20th century. Now, vaccine technology has been around since like the 1600s. Human beings figured out how to take a strain of the virus and have it be very weakened or have it be dead, inject that so that people can develop a resistance to the virus. But what's happened in the 20th century is our ability to distribute vaccines, our ability to produce vaccines has greatly improved with the transportation and industrialization technologies that have grown as well. And the other thing with vaccines is that one is developed to cure smallpox. And smallpox is eradicated from the human population throughout the 20th century. And of course, today with COVID-19, you're all very familiar with vaccines. Now, I see that my laser pointer decided to go to birth control, and that's the other one. When we talk about birth control, there's lots of different forms of birth control, but what we're talking about here is the pill. We're talking about birth control pills that women, especially in the industrialized world, can access. So if you take a look at the level of fertility chart that's on the right, you will see the numbers dropping down. So like the red represents the change over time from 1950 to 1975. And you can see where the nations are. And the nations at the lower end of fertility are going to be the more industrialized nations. That's where your birth control is coming into play. And as birth control becomes more accessible to more of the population, we can expect to see a drop in fertility rates across the board. So women are going to go from having 5 babies per woman to about 2, maybe a little less than 2 per woman. I don't know how they manage that 0.9, but whatever. And then one thing to keep in mind with all of this, not just the medical technologies, but all of this, is the advantages that the developed countries have. They have more access to these medical technologies than underdeveloped nations. And that's going to set up a disparity in standard of living and quality of life that we see playing out to today. There's a reason why the United States has a longer lifespan than some countries in Africa. And that's by virtue of our access to medical technology. Okay, so I see that my laser pointer is going all over the place. Let's go ahead and talk about disease, a topic that many of us have become experts in. So there's many different types of diseases that we see play out throughout the 20th century. And diseases are nothing new. I mean, diseases have been around as long as human beings have been around. But what's going to happen with globalization is diseases are going to be able to spread more easily. So some diseases are associated with poverty. One such disease is malaria. Malaria, as you might know, is caused by mosquito bites. Mosquitoes biting human beings and injecting human beings with the virus that causes malaria. In parts of Africa where there are just impoverished conditions, the people are exposed to the elements night and day. So when they're sleeping, mosquitoes are biting them and they're passing malaria all around by virtue of this. And per year, you have about 95,000 deaths, most of them very young children from the ages of 2 to 5. And malaria, there is no known cure. We haven't developed a vaccine, though there have been some people who have been working on it. Malaria is best treated by keeping mosquitoes out. So there's a push for mosquito nets to prevent the mosquitoes from coming into people's homes. Tuberculosis is an infection of the respiratory system that can spread very easily amongst the population. Coughing, sneezing, this allows for rapid spread of the virus. And tuberculosis is particularly pronounced in overcrowded cities where people are living virtually on top of one another. So if you go through a lot of this world, there are a lot of urban areas, and urbanization is another consequence of globalization. Urban areas where there's people are jam-packed in, and tuberculosis can spread rapidly in those situations. And then cholera. With cholera, you have this idea of contaminated water that will infect the population. So the water is dirty, if the water is undrinkable, people are still going to drink the water because water is needed. And as a consequence, cholera is a bacterial infection that develops from drinking contaminated water and can lead to death very quickly. We saw a lot of cholera outbreaks during the Industrial Revolution, and then we still see cholera outbreaks from time to time in impoverished areas where the drinking water is contaminated. And if you take a look over at the graph that I have to the right, and you look down towards the bottom, let me see if I can find it for you. No, I can't. It was right there. Hold on. Oh, Cholera 6 outbreak. So from 1817 to 1923, 1 million people dead from cholera outbreaks in various cities. Those outbreaks still continue today. It's not the same thing, but they still continue in impoverished areas. Now, there are also diseases associated with global interactions. Since people can move around the globe much more easily, we're going to get an interaction that's going to lead to the spread of diseases. The influenza pandemic of 1918, which is commonly called the Spanish flu. If you take a look at the virus chart, which is really disturbing to look at, the green ball, that represents the Spanish flu and the number of deaths associated with the Spanish flu epidemic. Now, oh, there you go. My cursor is moving all over the place. So what caused the spread of the Spanish flu or the influenza was that soldiers in Europe who had come from all over the globe, it wasn't just from the United States or other European nations, but they were coming from South Asia, they were coming from Africa, they were coming from Oceania. They get infected with the H1N1 variant of influenza. And when they travel back to their respective countries, that variant quickly starts to spread amongst the population, causing many, many deaths, basically. HIV AIDS, if you take a look again at the graph, you'll see the kind of the red one on the second line, and it says 1981 to the present. We're looking at about 25 to 35 million people. HIV is the virus that causes autoimmune deficiency syndrome. And basically what the virus does is it completely wipes out a person's autoimmune system, making them vulnerable to any disease. So diseases that we would consider benign could kill a person off who's lost their immune system. Today, there is a treatment to prevent the virus from developing the autoimmune deficiency syndrome. So in other words, you can have the virus, but if you're taking this treatment, you can basically prevent your autoimmune system from being destroyed. However, again, the developed nations, there's more access to it than the underdeveloped nations. We have rates of infection that reach 10% in some countries in the world. And the other thing is HIV AIDS is spread through exchange of bodily fluids, whether it be unprotected sex, transfusion of blood, or it be through, sharing of needles. HIV rapidly spreads if it's not prevented. There's no cure right now. And from 25 to 35 million deaths, this has been an ongoing epidemic or a pandemic. And particularly hits the underdeveloped countries of Africa, especially, very hard. Ebola, which you can see as a little one, it's like the third one from the end, and it says 11.3 thousand. So, it's 11,300 people. And that's from 2014 to 2016. But we put it out there because Ebola has about a 50% fatality rate. If you get Ebola, it's a coin flip, essentially. So that's why everybody's so quick to try and stop Ebola from spreading, because that would produce death at a scope that we wouldn't comprehend. To give you an idea, COVID-19, you're talking about a death rate of about 0.5% to 1%. So just multiply that all by 50. And that's what Ebola would do if it was spreading the way COVID-19 is spreading. That's why everybody jumps as soon as Ebola is mentioned. COVID-19, if you take a look again, you can see COVID-19 is in the middle of the second line at 1.8 million, but that's as of December 31st, 2020. It's an ongoing epidemic. And we could probably take that now and push it up closer, probably past the 17th century plagues. So you're talking about an ongoing pandemic. And if you understand that, then you understand the other ones, to be honest with you. And then, of course, with these longer lifespans, we have diseases associated with those longer lifespans, such as Alzheimer's, which is a breakdown and deterioration of the mental facilities of a person. And the reason why we see an increase in the number of Alzheimer's disease cases is because people are living longer. Human beings are living long enough to have the opportunity to develop Alzheimer's. Heart disease is another one that comes with our modern living. And again, I apologize for the laser pointer. Just ignore that. Of course, as I say, you really can't take your eyes off it, can you? But heart disease is another one. Heart disease comes from our lifestyle. It comes from stress. It comes from eating habits. Now that I can live longer, that just gives me more opportunity to shove McDonald's in my mouth. The idea that a lot of our jobs involve sitting and we're not exercising and moving as much, which is going to lead to heart disease. So this idea of lack of exercise, poor diet, poor sleep that is connected to the modern world, and high levels of stress are going to contribute to a growing number of cases of heart disease. This is the number one leading cause of death in the United States, certainly. So you're talking about a significant disease that is connected to the way we live our lives. And of course, mental illness is another one that we can tie into this. Is it a question of anxiety cases are going up because we're finally destigmatizing anxiety? Or is the modern world, with all its various components, contributing to that increase in anxiety? So depression and anxiety are on the rise. We can probably connect that to our modern living. Okay, last slide for today is globalization and the environment. So the environment is affected by globalization. This is not a hard one to figure out. You guys have been told this plenty. So as I need more food to feed more people, I need to cut down more trees to get more land to farm. This is what we call deforestation. So I'm cutting down more trees to create more farmland to feed an ever-growing population. And the rainforest, if you look at the Amazon rainforest deforestation, you can see in 2008 this high number of acres that are being chopped down. And then you can see kind of it being scaled back until this past year, where we've seen the numbers jump back up. The Amazon rainforest, these trees, they take in carbon dioxide and they push out oxygen. So this is going to affect air quality. This is going to affect greenhouse gases, greenhouse gases not being absorbed in by nature. And it's going to present a problem for the environment. Desertification is where the land literally gets exhausted and starts turning into a desert, where you can no longer grow anything. And desertification is usually caused by land mismanagement. People are not using the land well. They're not doing what they need to replenish the nutrients in the land and to give the land a break. Air quality, this is a big one. With all these factories and all these cars and modes of transportation and the burning of fossil fuels, there are emissions into the air, and these are pollutants, whether it be carbon dioxide or it be smoke, whatever it is, these pollutants go into the air and they decrease the quality of air, breathable air for human beings. And that has health ramifications. Respiratory infections are going to grow, respiratory diseases are going to grow because of this poor air quality. Now, in the United States, we have seen an improvement of air quality over the past 50 years, but that's not happening necessarily in every single country. Countries that are recently industrialized are seeing lower levels of air quality. Also, with more people and more crops to be irrigated, there's a stress on our fresh water supply. So if 70% of the world is covered by water, only 3% of that water is fresh water. Only 3% of that water is usable for us as drinking water and as growing crop water. And what's happening is that as we get more and more demands for that water, we're putting a stress on that supply. There are some people who have predicted that future wars are going to be over water supply, especially in the Middle East and other parts that are facing desertification. So, and as droughts increase, it becomes even more of a problem. And then finally, we have global warming. Simply put, we have this increase in emissions, increase in greenhouse gases. Those gases basically serve to cook the earth, if you will. If I remember this right, radiation from the sun comes in, usually bounces off the earth and goes back out. But what the greenhouse gas does is it stops that radiation from going out, which serves to heat up the surface of the earth. And when we talk about the causes of environmental problems, one, we connect it to industrialization and globalization. If I have more of these ships going across the sea carrying products all over the world, I have more emissions coming from those ships. If I have more demands on factories to manufacture more goods, I have more emissions from those factories. And that's part of globalization and industrialization. But we can also connect it to urbanization and I forgot this, overpopulation or growing population. Urbanization, what you're doing is you're crowding people together. They're going to produce waste, and that waste has to go somewhere. So that's going to put a stress on resources. Those people demand food. Those people demand water. That's going to put a stress on resources, which is going to lead to increased agriculture that will lead to deforestation. So the causes of the environmental problems, when you look at number one, what you want to realize is that a lot of this is driven by man's activities, by human activity over the centuries. And then the second thing is urbanization, which is also human activity, but it's a development, it's a consequence of industrialization. All of these contribute to the environmental problems. And I have a feeling I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Lastly, the effects of environmental problems. One, this creates competition over resources. Nations are going to compete over oil access. Nations are going to compete over fresh water access. So let's think of a hypothetical. Let's say there are two countries that a river flows through. So the river doesn't care about political boundaries. The river just flows. And rivers are important for irrigation. So let's say the country upriver decides to dam up the river. And they want to dam up the river so they can create a reservoir so that they can irrigate their crops. Well, the country downriver has just been screwed out of fresh water. That can create a tension between the two countries. But not only do we get competition over resources, but we get cooperation on solutions. So the environmental problems that I'm talking about are global problems. Global warming affects every country in the world. It doesn't really care. So therefore, the solutions become global in nature. For example, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. What happens is that signatory nations from across the globe agree to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions over a certain period of time. The United States consequently did not join the Kyoto protocols. I think what we had an issue was that not all countries were being asked to carry the load. We felt like we were being asked to do too much, and there are other countries that weren't even trying to be environmentally friendly who weren't being asked to do as much. So we didn't go into the Kyoto protocols, but in 2015, we had the Paris Accords. And the Paris Accords kind of create something very similar, a global commitment to reducing emissions. And in 2017, of course, we get out of the Paris Accords. And then in 2020 or 21, we go back into the Paris Accords. So that's where I'll leave this. As always, bring your questions. Next time, we'll talk about how globalization impacts the economy and how it impacts impacts culture. And that will be the second of the 3 lectures related to this topic. So until then, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you soon. Bye.